All right, so let me walk you through what I found to be, or what I find to be, some key takeaways. We talk about the features of disinhibited social engagement disorder. So the hallmarks are relatively clear. Um, they are overly familiar behavior with relative strangers, which creates social risk, that are clearly culturally inappropriate, and also violate the social boundaries of the culture. Generally, at least in my experience, that's been pretty clear. Just like we were talking about earlier with reactive attachment disorder, if you're working in a setting where you're working with um, children and families of cultures that you are not terribly familiar with, or particularly if you're working with migrant or refugee people, circumstances. That's something to factor into all of this for sure. But those are the hallmarks. And the other thing where it's congruent with reactive attachment disorder is the social neglect is a requirement. So if you're observing these behaviors or you're hearing about them from other sources, and there's no evidence of that social neglect, then you're likely looking at something else diagnostically. Now, speaking of other things diagnostically, um, the there's there can be high co-occurrence with developmental delays, cognitive language delays, other things from this neurodevelopmental disorders section. Um, Also, neglect, and things like lack of access to medical care, obvious malnutrition, obvious signs of abuse, which is not called out specifically in the DSM here, but unfortunately is part of what I've seen. Um, these and the way I think about it is there can be connections in disinhibited social engagement disorder. That can be connections to biological or psychiatric conditions, like developmental language delays, cognitive impairments. Um, but there can also be, can be more connected to social things like, unfortunately, severe abuse and neglect. And also, sadly, and I've seen this, sometimes there's both. And so these things can, in my mind, elevate the risk of developing disinhibited social engagement disorder, and can certainly be co-occurring as the as the book suggests, the DSM book. And then just two points about manifestations of disinhibited social engagement disorder in adolescence and then in adulthood. There are two takeaways for each of those age groups that are consistent with my experience. So I called them out here from the DSM. Um, the Some of the output of the indiscriminate social behavior, or sort of um, you know poor social choices. One of the ways this manifests themselves, and this is can be fairly noticeable because in adolescence the focus turns to the peer group, as you guys know from just basic human development. That two of the hallmarks that can be connected to disinhibited social engagement disorder in adolescence can be that they have more their peer relationships appear to be almost exclusively superficial. In other words, they don't have a close group of friends, and they don't have like a close friend, a bestie kind of thing. Oftentimes, and whatever level of connections they have, there's often more peer conflicts um, with adolescents with a disinhibited social engagement disorder. And this can continue to this particular diagnosis can continue to surface itself in problematic ways in adulthood. So two of them are excessive self-disclosure and what the book calls reduced stranger awareness. How I interpret that and how I've observed it in experience, on the latter, terms of reduced stranger awareness. It's just oftentimes just what would be in terms of poor decision making about social engagements and level of involvement with people that the person really doesn't know very well. Um, that certainly that can be sexual, but it's not limited to that. Um, and so what that creates its own risks. And then the self-disclosure part that can be problematic in lots of different social circles. They can create perhaps more minor social risks in that it can cause problems like work if you're one who's starting a new job and they're just over disclosing and about personal issues in a way that's creating problems in the workplace for themselves. And then risk can be more significant in terms of social decision making, and with other adults. And so that's the summary of what I consider the hallmarks and sort of the things to think about if you are finding yourself, where the criteria for disinhibited social engagement disorder is. It seems like it may be fitting what you're observing or the data that you're getting for a client.